I am very grateful for the invitation and the honor of being the keynote speaker for this community of people who have an understanding and an attachment to photography. There are people today, matter of fact, most living people today have never heard of the daguerreotype, much less seen one. In the photography community, of course, we all know something, at least, about the daguerreotype. But there is a vast population, and will always be a vast population, who have no idea what you're talking about. The word daguerreotype itself is obscurant. What does exactly does it refer to? Actually, although denounced for naming it after himself, it was a brilliant solution to what to call it. What is photography is still a question that's not so easily answered. Let's say one of these people who have never heard or seen a daguerreotype wanders in to the current exhibition. Their first reaction will be, what are these brightly illuminated little mirrors? It will not be, what are these photographs? It'll be a response to a very unusual environment, unusual display. The nearest thing to it in our normal experience is the jewelry store, where intense light is brought upon highly reflective, small things that have a great preciousness to them and great value to them. Believe it or not, I've experienced showing a daguerreotype to someone who has never seen one before, and they can't see it. They can't understand what it is they're looking at. They actually cannot see it in the sense of understanding what it is. To be told it's a photograph is surprising. They see more the reflectivity, the changing aspect of the image, but it's very much an unfamiliar object and an unfamiliar visual experience that you have to actually learn. Some of us see it immediately. Somehow, some way, some of our sensibilities are developed that we see it. If we see a good one, and not all daguerreotypes are good, you experience something that you experience in no other form of imagery. And that experience is a little hard to exactly describe. I'll come back to it, but some of you know what I'm talking about, particularly those of you who are struck and changed and become obsessed with knowing more and eventually with wanting to be able to make such a thing. If the visitor to the gallery is told these are photographs made by the first form of photography, they might be able to see a little better that these are images, but they make no sense in terms of a clear theme, a clear application, a clear aesthetic. It's quite a jumble of imagery, some of it which relates to what you know, some of it relates to something you don't know and can't understand. In other words, a bit of a puzzle, exactly what is manifest. If told this is the oldest form of photography, they might wonder, why dig so deep in the garbage heap of technology to do the first form, which is associated always with primitive, limited, obsolete, the past? Why dig so deep in the past? In this era in which we're really at the edge of what they call the metaverse, in which virtual visual reality is something you can live in better than you can live in the life that goes beyond virtual, right? Virtual or assisted means better ultimately than the life you're imprisoned in living. When technology has given us the ability to make color and motion pictures immediately that you can send immediately around the world, when 30 years ago, that was inconceivable that we would have that power individually. In an era in which nobody is nostalgic about talking on the landline telephone, nobody's saying, I prefer that to the handheld phone, right? In my lifetime, I remember as a boy, the telegram. I don't think the telegram still exists, but the power of receiving a knock on the door and a paper envelope given to you by a man in a uniform, this message is important. It's gone. That life is gone. That life is gone. Not that time is gone. That life experience is gone. Why would you reinstitute the telegram? There's a case for it. The contemporary daguerreotypists might say, yes, we should telegram each other. But how would you do that? The technology doesn't exist. So someone might walk out of the room, the exhibition, no better, a little more puzzled, perhaps, but not really very much interested in deep answering and further pursuit of knowledge of the questions that might come up. Others will be changed. They will see something they've never seen before. It's hard to have that experience in this present day. Again, because photography has made it possible to see all sorts of things you would never see, you would never be allowed to see, you never could see. Really, I've seen more things than I should have seen because of photography in one form or the other. And I've seen all sorts of types of photographs made in different ways. But still, a daguerreotype can be an experience like you've never had before. Not only a visual experience, but an emotional experience. Not all daguerreotypes are good. The 19th century examples are not all well made. Some are really very poor. Others are so good as to defy understanding. They are transcendently beautiful, transcendently provoking. They are an experience, they provide an experience of seeing what's depicted, of being in the presence at that moment of the making. It's such a profound illusion as to be a form of virtual reality experience. But seeing the actual past, not having the illusion of what the past was, but seeing, being present in the past, the daguerreotype can render that. That is, really, there's no other experience of the senses. Yes, we can hear a recording of the past, sense of sound, but we're never feeling that we're actually there. But the daguerreotype provides that ability and something more. Those people who have that experience may wish to see more, see the older examples, see more examples. Their curiosity as to what is this will be provoked. Some will want to see themselves in the daguerreotype. That's usually the common reaction of those who would like to actually make daguerreotypes, but know they do not have what it takes to do that. But they'd like to find somebody to make their portrait and see themselves in it. And to be sort of immortalized in a certain way by the daguerreotype. That was the main application of the daguerreotype in the first 15 years of photography, was the immortalization, at least the casting into the future a memorial portrait of oneself, one's loved ones. That was the main application of it and the main way of making money by the technology. Some will want to make daguerreotypes. And it's not an easy thing to accomplish, even though it's easier today than it was 20 years ago, 40 years ago, 80 years ago. It's much easier today than it was in the past, and I assume will become easier in the future. Again, in my lifetime, there was a day in which I did not know where to go to talk to someone who has made a daguerreotype. Now you have many, many choices, many choices. There is a history to making daguerreotypes from the very beginning to the end of its commercial dominance. The first 15 years of the history of photography is the history of the daguerreotype. The world learned what photography was by the daguerreotype. They learned what it was good for by the daguerreotype. Everything that was ever done with photography was attempted and to a degree achieved by the daguerreotype. The technology is profoundly represented by the daguerreotype. That first 20 years of photography is dominated by the daguerreotype, was begun by the daguerreotype. From 1855 to 1889, there was very little production, some, but very little. But at the 50th anniversary, 1889, some old photographers who had begun their career as daguerreotypists began to make daguerreotypes again, not only out of nostalgia for the first days, but in celebration of a process that had something very particular about it. And not just one thing that was particular about it, but many aspects of particularity. In the United States, there were 3 daguerreotypists who began to make daguerreotypes again in 1889. In 1939, the 100th anniversary of photography, in which there was some international celebration, mostly by the industry, bringing forward the history of the technology that they had developed to a very high degree, stimulated a number of individuals to attempt to make daguerreotypes again. In 1939, the daguerreotype is out of living memory. 1889, it was still within the living memory of many, not just who made it, but who had used it, who had experienced first photography. In 1939, there was nobody alive from that era. Some attempts were made, and some were stimulated to try, but did not succeed. So in England and France, in the United States in particular, there are historical figures who I know had made an attempt. One of them in the United States, who must be considered, I think, the father of contemporary daguerreotypy, because his work led to others succeeding was a man called, Ray Phillips Jr. Ray Phillips in 1939 desired to make daguerreotypes. What stimulated him exactly, I don't know, but he had already started to collect as a teenager. His father told him, "Don't worry, I will support you in your desire to make daguerreotypes." In other words, told him he would not say, that's nonsense, but also would pay for that pursuit. A very important factor in this. At that time, Ray faced the problem that all contemporary daguerreotypists face. Number one, where do you get instructions? Where is the information on how to make it? In 1939, there was no reprinting of literature from the 19th century technology of photography. He had to learn French in order to read the Daguerre manual, of which there was one copy in a library in San Francisco that he found. He learned French to read it. That gave him enough information to know the next problem was, where do you get the stuff? You can't go to the camera store and buy a daguerreotype camera. Although all cameras can be daguerreotype cameras. You think you need a special camera. Where do you get the processing equipment, the mercury bath, the iodizing box? Nowhere to be found. Where do you get plates? Where do you get that chemistry, which seems to be problematical from the standpoint of how do you handle iodine and bromine and mercury, well known to be poisonous, a very active and devilish chemistry. He solved that problem. He found a 19th century outfit in antique dealers. He made a survey throughout the United States. Do you have any? And found a complete outfit in a trunk. American daguerreotype, chamfered front, camera, tripod, sensitizing boxes, developing box, plate buffs, box of plates. That outfit is now in Japan, by the way. It was bought by the Tokyo Metropolitan Museum of Photography. I was instrumental in selling it to them, strangely enough. With this camera, with these plates, he made his first daguerreotypes. This in 1942. His example, which gradually was made known more in the 1960s, when he was sought out because of his collection. In the 1960s, there started to be more interest in the history of 19th century photography, more collecting, more exhibitions, more publication, the republications of manuals, the formation of collecting groups, in which the daguerreotype began to be looked at again in a different way, as very interesting, something not just old photographs of people nobody knows, difficult to see, little, which was the general attitude. Who wants a picture of somebody else's grandfather? That attitude began to change. And he was sought out, Ray Phillips, because of his collection that he had collected in the 1940s and 50s before anybody collected. Anyway, the point is, he worked to a certain point and stopped. He satisfied his desire to make daguerreotypes. When he bought some unused daguerreotype plates from Southworth and Hawes, when the Southworth and Hawes material was dispersed, he found that those plates were much better than the ones that he had worked on before. He made a discovery that's a very important discovery that all daguerreotypists know, contemporary as well as past. It's the plate, it's the plate, it's the plate. That problem and that key, every contemporary daguerreotypist knows. Outside of that community, no one understands what the plate is to the process. But the plate defines the process. The plate distinguishes the process. The plate controls quality. And a quality plate is the key to quality daguerreotypes. Right? Anyway, in the 1960s, lots of other people try to make daguerreotypes, and it's easier. There's more equipment found. Other old 19th century survivals come out and begin to be collected. Replicas are made. Modern equivalent, but made in the style of. And the examples of this being seen are imitated by people who make their own individually, whether exactly the 19th century model or evolving a different model. But they begin to work again the process. And a community begins to form. There's other people, 3, 4, 5 in the United States in the 1970s, early 1970s. This is not the place to give the full history of contemporary daguerreotyping. I'm going to hasten to move along, but to say, making a daguerreotype, some daguerreotype, a bad daguerreotype is a triumph. Many people try and fail. Many people succeed in making some success. Any success is a great success. Few go beyond that. I'm a daguerreotypist, they can say. I made a daguerreotype. And that's a distinction. If not an honor, a distinction. A distinction to yourself, if not to others. Very few continue beyond some sort of first success. In one way, the daguerreotype is the easiest of photographic processes. And in another way, it's the hardest of photographic processing. How is that possible? Contemporary daguerreotypists know what I'm saying. If you're not a contemporary daguerreotypist, it's very hard to explain why it's the easiest and why it's the hardest. Irving Poborowski, who is now deceased, was the first of the contemporary workers, or let's say 20th century workers, since some problem, I think, exists with the term contemporary daguerreotypist. The 20th century daguerreotypist was the first to achieve a level of control of the process equivalent to the highest professional production of the 19th century. Any daguerreotype is an interesting daguerreotype. A very bad one is still an interesting one. In what way is maybe hard to say, but it's a lesson, it's a thrill, it's a disappointment, it's a whatever, it's a number of strange things that are hard to put words to. But it has what is really one of the essential aspects of the appeal of the daguerreotype. It's like no other photograph. Like no other photograph. Quintessentially photographic, it's like no other photograph. What is that? What is that quality? In part, it's the material. It's a metal plate. It's an all metal photograph. In part, it's the visual phenomenon. It gives much of the light that goes into it, unlike the paper photograph, which absorbs much of the light that goes into it. A bad daguerreotype is still an interesting daguerreotype, which is an aspect of contemporary art photography in which bad technique can produce unusual qualities that were rejected by commercial photography, by industrial photography, but nonetheless are visually interesting, but are not expressive of control. They're accidents. There are wonderful accidents in the daguerreotype, wonderful ones in practicing the daguerreotype that were not used aesthetically in the 19th century, but existed in the 19th century. Irving's example of achieving the 19th century high standard, the plateau of the daguerreotype is not a pinnacle. It's like the Great Pyramid's top, it's flat. The great daguerreotype can be on this end or on this end of a wide spectrum of visual qualities. But there are many layers to the Great Pyramid, right down to the very bottom. And only daguerreotypists know what those levels are and what's in them. But all strive to achieve the top plateau, that plateau where the real aesthetic of the daguerreotype is, which is something very difficult to express. It's a purity and a perfection like no other visual form of imagery, a purity and a perfection. Achieving that level, even by accident, is a great moment. And it happens every once in a while. Often very early in your attempting to make daguerreotypes. One day you get one that's wonderful. Wow, I'm there. The next day you do the same thing and nothing. Everyone knows that experience. And you have to work hard to get back there. The process is a balancing of variables. For so much this, so much that. For so much that, then so much this. From so much this to so much that again. 5, 6, 7 different balancing of variables. No two people make the daguerreotype the same. They cannot. They cannot. Just being able to make them the same by yourself is a challenge, much less doing it the way somebody else does. This existed in the 19th century as well. If you have a good eye for the daguerreotype, which you can only get by working the process, well, you can see the 19th century range of qualities, range of skill, and the high end as opposed to the less than the high end. These are things you have to learn by doing. You can't learn it any other way. Irving's example made it possible and also made it important to achieve that level again. And that has been achieved by 4 or 5 people today, in which they can consistently make a decent quality, something comparable to the best daguerreotypes of the 19th century. But they all face the problem of what do you photograph? What do you direct this process, which is special, which makes everything it depicts special, which even when it's bad is special? What do you aim that powerful force, if you will, at? Some imitate the 19th century. They take pictures of people in funny costume, often reenactors. Some go modern. They take pictures of motorcycles. Very typical of the contemporary daguerreotypist, as to photograph something very modern that didn't exist in the 19th century. So though the process culturally says the first, the oldest, the 19th century, it has to say also the contrast, oh no, this is not the 19th century. What is this? What is this thing, this time aspect? Others start to use the qualities of the daguerreotype that were rejected in the 19th century, such as overexposure producing blue, which was rejected as poor technique in the 19th century, but very much an aspect of contemporary work in which that neon blue, which by divine, some force divine, the sky turns blue when it overexposes instead of red or yellow, but actually turns the color of the sky. You see that in contemporary work. That was rejected in the 19th century. So they are developing an aesthetic taste that was not a 19th century application of that aspect of the process. Some make contact prints, negatives or positives, using the daguerreotype plate like a printing medium, which was not done in the 19th century, although was realized in the 19th century. Well, in essence, contemporary workers, what are called contemporary workers, or the workers of today, for the moment I'm going to call it, the workers of the daguerreotype today, are realizing that the process is really not so much like one process, but is a very wide and really unexplored form of photography. It's special, and if you work it, you're special. It's unfamiliar, but becoming more familiar. I think Mr. Arai intended that more people understand, more people should be stimulated, more of the people who work should communicate, and there be a new evolving era in which more is discovered, more is seen, an appropriate application of the potentials of the process are seen. I say that's a very nice sentiment, and I support it. However, let me introduce some different concept. I believe, well, it's not so much those who are devoting their work to the daguerreotype. They appreciate what the daguerreotype is. It's the cultural community, the artistic community that has to be convinced that daguerreotypes made today are legitimate activities, if not art, legitimately photography, I guess artistic photography. But it isn't recognized as that. Let me know, please, contemporary daguerreotypists, when you're able to sell a daguerreotype for $10,000 that you made. Really $20,000, I'd like to know. $10,000 is not going to be a significant moment. And when you sell more than one at $20,000, let me know, please, when that happens. I'd be interested to know. The art world pays, well, whoever buys art pays tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of dollars for contemporary art, for examples of contemporary art. The best of contemporary daguerreotyping is, I'd say, worthy of similar prices, but it's not going to come. And it's not going to come, maybe ever. Does that matter? Yes, to some, it's going to matter because it's an expensive proposition making daguerreotypes. It's one of the barriers that keeps people out. Costs a lot of money, and you don't get much back in terms of money for your best efforts. You might be able to make a professional racket out of it, teaching, selling here and there once in a while, writing about it. No, nobody pays you to do that, right? I don't know, making portraits for other people. I don't want to be a portrait photographer. You don't want to be a portrait photographer. You'll make a portrait once in a while for $1,000 here and there, but nah, it's not a good business, never was a good business. How are you going to be rewarded for your efforts? Do you need to be rewarded? And I say here's a different concept. I believe contemporary daguerreotypy falls into the category of esoteric photography. Esoteric photography. It hasn't been defined as a branch of photography. There's exoteric and esoteric. Maybe your vocabulary doesn't have it. There's what's known to the many, and there's what's only known to the few. It will only be known to the few. There are many barriers that are going to keep not only others out from making the daguerreotype, but others out from understanding the daguerreotype. Daguerreotyping, practiced here after the era of its commercial dominance, is a form of photography, but a occult form of photography, one that is shadowed, is kept out of common understanding. It's more of an experience of alchemy than it is of chemical imaging. Alchemy is not understood today and dismissed as nonsense, fantasy. Wow, for a long time, people pursued that fantasy. And the real initiates of alchemy understood that the process of turning a base metal into gold, or creating the elixir of eternal life, was not really what it was about. It was the purification of one's own self, a secondary function to that, a spiritual exercise and a initiatory experience. The daguerreotypist today understands that there are stages of initiation as you work with the process. It isn't just you sensitize something, you put it in a camera, you expose it, you develop it, and you look at it. There are so many aspects of, I'm going to use the simple term enjoyment, the achieving of different levels of getting your equipment together, getting your chemistry together, getting your plates polished, getting everything in order, the moment of making the photograph. But what comes out is not a photograph, it's a thing. The experience of seeing the first sight of a transmutation, if you will, just metals and gases turned into an image like no other, a visual experience like no other. You develop a Daguerrean vision. You see what is potentially a great daguerreotype, potentially. You can sort of understand you're going to see something special, but you can't exactly say how it's going to look. But you develop Daguerrean vision, Daguerrean sensibilities. Even if you're a good photographer to begin with, it's not enough to assure that you know what you're going to be getting. The worker today is a member of what is essentially a form of mystery school. I'm going to leave it there and not go much into greater detail. I'll someday make the case here at another meeting of the brother and sisterhood of initiates, right? And we'll welcome new members. But let me tell those who are already initiates, don't make it so easy. Making it easy, too easy, robs it of its aspect of refining yourself. The spiritual aspect of daguerreotyping. Everyone knows what I'm talking about who has made daguerreotypes. If you haven't, you're never going to know until you make it. That's what I have to say.